Well, back when I was a young kid, I was fascinated with magic, and I met a kid in high school who could do magic with the phone system, and it was called phone phreaking. So it was kind of exploring the telephone network, albeit, it wasn't really illegal at the time. It was kind of like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were doing in the mid-1970s. Were experimenting with a device called the blue box. And what a blue box is, it's a device that emits multi-frequency tones. And when the phone company was using in-band signaling back in the 80s and 90s, you could actually control the phone company. So I was really fascinated with how this technology worked. And I was a prankster. So I loved pulling pranks on friends and family. One of my favorites that's very well known is I used to modify a friend's home phone to a payphone. So whenever his parents tried to make a call, I'd say, please deposit 25 cents. When he would call me and say, change it back, I'm gonna get grounded, I would change it to a prison phone, collect calls only, right? So I loved doing this pranksterism, and to be a better prankster, I'd need to gain better access to the phone company's networks. And they were moving towards from electromechanical switching to electronic switching, which was controlled by front-end computers. So I started my foray of hacking really by hacking the phone company. Okay. But hacking the phone company to pull pranks, right? So that's when I started this in the 70s. Yeah, when I first got into trouble, I ended up in court one day for what they call a bail hearing. And the federal prosecutor told the judge, not only do we have to hold Mr. Mitnick without bail because he's such a grave danger to national security, that we have to make sure he can't get access to the phone. And the judge, not being computer astute or technology astute, said, why? And the prosecutor went on to say, well, if Mr. Mitnick gets access to a phone, he could pick up the phone, dial up to NORAD. NORAD is our Northern Air Defense. Whistle into the phone, communicate with the modem, and launch an ICBM, right? So I started laughing in federal court because that's nothing, I never heard something so stupid in my life. And the judge actually agreed with the government, and I was in solitary for a year. So when I continued my hacking endeavors after I got out, I figured the government would do it again. So I became a fugitive. It was more catch me if you can, right? And the government was chasing me from hacking a bunch of cell phone companies because I was fascinated with how a cell phone worked, because I was interested in radio and interested in computing, and a cell phone is a computer and a radio, essentially what it is. So I wanted to understand how it worked. So I made a stupid and regrettable decision to hack into these these cellular manufacturers, Nokia, Motorola, and get the source code to the firmware on the chip inside so I could study and understand how it worked. And then it became a trophy. So more than now, it was so much fun hacking in that I go, oh, rather than study the code, I got a mobile magazine. And I just went down the list of all the different cell phone manufacturers that existed back in the day and hacked all of them as a trophy. So it was more of trophy hunting. And then, and then eventually, the victims, which were the cell phone companies, didn't figure it out. What happened is I stored the source code on a server at USC, which is a university in LA, and one of the admins found it, and then he called the FBI, and then the FBI looked at it and said, wow, we have the source code from all these companies. The FBI told the companies. They didn't even know, right? So I was #1 on the list of suspects because I was well known in this area. So that's why I became, kind of the FBI's most wanted. What happened was when I was released from custody, I had no idea what I would do. There was no, when I was a hacker, there was no such thing as penetration testing. That didn't even exist. And when I was released from custody, 3 months later, Joseph Lieberman and Fred Thompson, they're kind of well known in the US, they're senators, and they invited me to Congress to testify on how the federal government could better protect their computer systems. And so I went and, I had to get permission from the probation department to travel to Washington. So I went there and I submitted written testimony, I did verbal testimony, and it kind of, started a career because then people started calling me. I never thought that would be like kind of the jump start to a career in security consulting. But naturally I fell into it, right? Because the difference between black hat hacking and ethical hacking is simply authorization from the client. Plus, I never had the motivation to make money or to harm anybody. Even when I started this, it was all about the pranksterism and the knowledge. So naturally, when ethical hacking started to exist and companies would use ethical hackers to test their security controls, I naturally fell into that. Kind of like Pablo Escobar becoming a pharmacist. Unfortunately, the companies, the types of vulnerabilities they're mitigating are pretty simple, right? But the more interesting stuff is like Heartbleed, the new one with the with Spectre and Meltdown. Those are cool because Intel now throw away all your chips and redesign, because now you could access kernel memory from user memory and read secrets in the cache. That's really cool stuff. That's like wow. But companies aren't when they hear about this in the press and they obviously how do we fix it? But companies are really focused on their network services that are exposed, their apps, their web apps that are internet facing, and of course their human factor of using social engineering tradecraft to attack their users. And wireless. So when we're doing security testing, we're focused on internal network, wireless internet facing web applications, SCADA, social engineering, and this type of thing. Not these fancy attacks that I think are super cool, right? So it's usually the simpler stuff, not the exciting stuff that companies are really having to deal with. Well, like making mistakes, like when they're using cloud services, like when they use Amazon, they have things called S3 buckets, right? And they they inadequately secure those buckets, so they're just world readable. I mean, stupid stuff like that. So their whole customer database, and their proprietary information is just out there for the taking. I mean, like really simple stuff like that. Having web applications that access a backend SQL database, and those web applications aren't even tested for security problems. They just host it out there, and there's a bunch of ways to get access to that SQL database. Now, there's a demo I do when I'm speaking in front of a US audience where I'm able to get anyone's mother's maiden name in the US. And it's interesting, the site that I use, I pay $60 a year. But what's funny is when I'm speaking for a more tech audience, what I show them is the URL, and in the URL is the SQL statement to grab the data from the database, which is really stupid, right? Because you could just modify that to do what we call SQL injection. It's just the straight SQL query. So companies, are making these, obviously configuration errors, not updating. There's a lot of companies that are still vulnerable to internal blue, and even Conflicker, and all these old bugs because they simply don't update, or they're using legacy technology and not upgrading their OS. Like they're still on Windows XP, which is EOL, end of life, and of course the human factor. I mean, when we test organizations using social engineering tradecraft, we always get in.